and the Secretary of the ASLA Northern California Chapter's Executive Committee. On behalf of the chapter, welcome to our Lunch with Leaders Industry Icons speaker series. Our speaker today is Michael Boland. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. If you're comfortable, please turn on your camera. It's just really makes it an easier chat for everybody if we could see everyone's faces. And also during these times, it's just nice to see everyone's faces. For anyone who may be interested in the executive committee's work, you'll see on our participants' photos, you'll see an extension with the ASLA, NCC, and those members are on the executive committee. So feel free to reach out to any one of us with questions or if you're interested in getting involved with the chapter. And then lastly, please use the chat function to send us any questions during the presentation. And we will follow up with a Q&A session after the talk. And so with that, I will share my screen. Share my screen. I want to give a warm welcome to our speaker today and also introduce Michael Boland. He is the Chief Park Officer at the Presidio Trust. For 3 decades, he has focused on transforming the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, and in particular, the Presidio of San Francisco, into a world-class national park in the heart of a city. He leads an interdisciplinary team in restoring the Presidio's mosaic of natural and cultural landscapes, striving to balance public access to the park with the preservation of its unique biodiversity. He has led the 20-year effort to restore the park's Tennessee Hollow watershed, returning streams once buried by the Army back to the surface. Other signature projects include the restoration of Mountain Lake, the creation of a comprehensive trail system, the restoration of the historic main parade ground, and the rehabilitation of the Presidio Officers Club. His largest project to date, working with James Corner Field Operations, is the Presidio Tunnel Tops, slated to open in 2022. It will consist of 14 acres of new landscape on top of highway tunnels, plus a youth campus to educate the next generation of park stewards. In 2020, the Presidio became the first park in the United States to receive the Green Flag Award, which recognizes the highest standards for visitor experience and management of parks and green spaces around the world. Michael Boland has a Bachelor of Arts in Architecture, a Master of Landscape Architecture, and a Master of City Planning, all from UC Berkeley. He is a Fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects. Please welcome Michael Boland.
All right, thank you, Carrie. Hello, everyone. Great to see you all today, albeit virtually. And I'm really delighted to be here to share the story of the Presidio. So, the Presidio is a really unique place. And so what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about my experience in the Presidio, talk a little bit about the evolution of the site, and then hear from you, actually. So I want to turn the tables on all of you at the end and ask you all some questions, as opposed to how these things are usually organized. So I hope you'll bear with me. The Presidio is unique among national park sites in a variety of
and even on a cool day. So
one of the most important ways in which the Presidio is unique is it has a very deep human history. It was the home of the Yalamu, which is a band of the Ramaytush Ohlone people who populated the entire San Francisco Peninsula, and we know of at least 2 village sites in the Presidio that are Ramaytush era. That all changed when the Spanish arrived in 1776, and they established a garrison there to guard the entrance to San Francisco Bay, which was strategically important because it was the largest bay on the west coast of the United States. That began about 220 years of military use of the site, first by the Spanish, then by the Mexican government, and then by the American military. And it's that history, that rich military history, juxtaposed against that long Native American history, has left a really complex series of stories inscribed in the landscape. Stories of colonialism, stories of courage, stories of loss. So it's a really, really incredibly complex place to interpret and to talk about. That military legacy also left an incredible collection of historic architecture and historic landscape architecture, one of the best collections of historic military landscapes and buildings in the United States. Because of its significance, it was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1962, and in 1972, it was included within the boundaries of the newly formed Golden Gate National Recreation Area. It has a really unique mosaic because of this long history of human use. It's about a 1,500-acre site. It has about 6 million square feet of buildings, a whole array of unique historic and natural landscapes, and really the infrastructure of a small town, all within this 2.5 square mile national park site. Now, although the military constantly rebuilt the Presidio to serve the evolving military needs of the United States, about 7% of the Presidio was never developed. And these tiny fragments sustained the best remaining collection of San Francisco's native ecosystems. This small biodiversity hotspot in the middle of this sea of derelict Army buildings and infrastructure. In 1989, the Army announced that after 220 years of military service, the Presidio would close. Now, because of the legislation that was passed in 1972, the land would automatically transfer to the National Park Service to become part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. And this created a really exciting opportunity. The opportunity of really achieving the vision that the national park had when they began to create urban national park sites in the 1972. The idea of bringing national park experiences to audiences that have historically been underrepresented in national park visitation and underserved by national parks. People of color, low-income families, and people with disabilities. So my story at the Presidio and in the GGNRA coincidentally also began in 1989. When just after I was about to graduate from graduate school at Cal, and I began an internship with the National Park Service. And it was an incredible experience. And for me, there were a series of pivotal moments. But one of the most important pivotal moments actually happened one day when I was standing on a bridge in Muir Woods. And I was there having a conversation with the then Chief of Natural Resources and the Chief of Cultural Resources. And they were arguing. And they were arguing about this rock wall that was built by the WPA to channelize Redwood Creek. And the argument, and what had become clear due to scientific research on the health of the creek, is that these rock walls were having a really negative impact on the health of the creek and specifically on the endangered coho salmon. And the conversation was about whether or not this wall should be removed, whether its historic values were more important than the negative ecological impacts it was having. And the conversation was completely pointless. It never got resolved. In fact, these walls are just now, over 30 years later, finally being removed. And in the meantime, over that 30-year period of time, the populations of these salmon have declined so dramatically. But my eyes were really opened at that moment to a couple of really important things. The first is, and none of this will surprise you because we're all wrestling with this, right? That at that time, the Park Service, like so many institutions, was really stuck in this nature-culture divide. And they seemed to not have the tools that they needed to bridge it. And that there was no creativity or no sort of third way or no sort of conversation about different models of nature. And I knew at that moment that I had to leave, actually, not because the Park Service was a terrible organization. They were an amazing institution, but because I wanted to explore challenges that I just couldn't explore in that ideological framework, in that policy framework. So I went to work for our nonprofit partner, the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy. And when I was there, I started working on a number of projects. One of the most interesting was one of my first projects. I began to work on developing an open island plan for Alcatraz Island. At that point, only a tiny bit of Alcatraz was open to the public. So we hired Larry Halpern, because he had done some early conceptual work about the island. We hired him to develop an open island plan. And as part of that, I had to go through a consultation process. I had to bring in Park Service biologists. I had to bring in biologists from the Golden Gate Audubon Society, because in the period of time the island had been closed, it had been re-inhabited by wildlife, specifically pelagic birds like this western gull. And the really interesting thing about it was that the way the island had been reoccupied by this wildlife, the wildlife was primarily there and utilizing these derelict structures that the Army had built, things like this abandoned apartment building, which is actually, were basically rubble piles. We found the greatest biodiversity on the entire island in these weird former structures that were all over the island. And so it really began to open my eyes to the opportunities and also the challenges of creating ecological value of preserving biodiversity in the urban environment. About the same time, I got involved in creating the National AIDS Memorial Grove in Golden Gate Park. And for me, this was a really profound experience. We were a small group, a scrappy group with no money. We had this kind of lovely but derelict site in Golden Gate Park, but we were all brought together by this dream. And the dream was that we could find a way to serve a community that was in crisis. In the early 90s, it was the peak of the AIDS crisis. Our community was absolutely in crisis. And we needed a place to create healing, to make healing happen. And so what we did is we basically tapped into that grief and brought together the community and engaged that community in cleaning up the site. And this began this iterative design and transformation process, working with the community over a series of decades that evolved ultimately into the National AIDS Memorial Grove. But for me, the most important thing about that experience was understanding that one of the really most important roles that landscape architects play is that role of paintbrush, right? That we're not really artists. I had grown up believing that architects and landscape architects were really artists. And I think for me, what the Grove really taught me, and what the work on Alcatraz and what the conversation in Muir Woods taught me, is that we're really just a paintbrush. And that all of these forces, the forces of nature, the forces of culture, the forces of community, that they express themselves through us. And that we then take those forces and transform the landscape inspired and motivated by those things. And so I brought those insights to the Presidio. When I turned my attention there, the Conservancy was very involved in the early formative thinking about the transformation of the Presidio. And we had a really huge challenge on our hands. The Army was leaving with over 20 years of deferred maintenance. We had 860 decaying buildings. We had a derelict 300-acre historic forest that was long past its lifespan. And the Park Service had done a study, and they had found that bringing the Presidio up to code, just renovating the buildings, would have increased the deferred maintenance backlog at that time for the entire national park system. So for all 410 units of the national park system, increased the deferred maintenance backlog by 50%. So there was no possible way that they could tackle this place using the conventional approach. And so we had to focus our energy on saving the place. And we had to develop a new way to think about how to steward public places in perpetuity. So we worked on a vision, and the vision was simple, that we would build a new kind of purpose-built partnership, and that we would pair the Park Service and the Parks Conservancy with a new kind of federal entity, the Presidio Trust. And the Presidio Trust was given a whole array of unique authorities. And those unique authorities were designed to allow this organization to harness the power of the public sector, but give us the flexibility of the private sector so that we could achieve financial self-sufficiency in 15 years. Because if we didn't achieve financial self-sufficiency, the land would all be sold and developed. So we set about transforming the place. Our first order of business was creating enough revenue to credibly argue to Congress and the American public that we'd achieved financial self-sufficiency. So we did a couple of really important things. We restored 1,300 units of derelict Army housing and created a new kind of national park community. And that community was really important. It brought vitality to what was at that point a really empty and pretty scary Army base. And it also established a really solid positive cash flow that we could then use to build our operations. We took some really big risks early. And we did that because we knew that we had only a few years before when the public was worried about whether or not we'd fail, that we could do some big things. And one of the big things that we did was we undertook the redevelopment of the Letterman Hospital site, where a 1950s brutalist concrete structure sat. It wasn't a contributing structure to our NHLD. And so we put out a call for proposals and were able to transform that site into the Letterman Digital Arts Campus. And this was really important because it really established the Presidio as a place that was going to work. And this was an 80-year agreement that we entered into. Clearly, somebody like George Lucas wouldn't enter into an 80-year agreement with an organization that was going to fall apart in a couple of years. So it was a very highly visible success and a way for us to establish both the solid cash flow, but also the credibility that allowed us to do so many other important things. We were capital constrained. One of the things that Congress didn't do was they didn't give us borrowing authority. And so we had to get very creative and worked with a lot of third parties that had plenty of capital to transform buildings like this, the old Public Health Service Hospital, into new facilities like this, fully restored and now housing 135 units of housing. We also came close to making some very big mistakes. And you all know about these because you all live in the neighborhood. We had proposals from not one, but two individuals that wanted to build very large museums in the park. And they, in retrospect, both of these would have been really terrible mistakes for the park. Luckily, the public knew better, and they saved us from ourselves by gently forcing us to say no. We also used philanthropy very strategically to, during those very early years, tap into about $200 million of private philanthropy so that we could take derelict sites like Crissy Field and create critical new visitor infrastructure at a time when we really were focusing 95% of our revenue on reinvesting, on the renovation of buildings so that we could reinvest that revenue and generate new revenue. So private philanthropy really played an absolutely critical role because it allowed us to transform the Presidio into a park at a time when we otherwise could never have done that. So as a result of all of these strategies, we saved the place. We made a down payment on transforming its landscapes, and we created a revenue engine that was enough so that we could credibly argue that the place had been saved. But there was really only one problem. We hadn't really created a national park. We had saved the place, but we hadn't really restored its ecological health, nor transformed it in a park for all. So we had to really, in our second chapter, focus on those two things. And we had some unique challenges in terms of accomplish both of those things. In terms of restoring the ecological health of the Presidio, one of the biggest challenges we had was actually the history of the site and this long history of transformation of the site for military purposes, which had destroyed sensitive habitats. It had introduced an incredible array of invasive exotic species. It had left contaminated sites, 13 Army landfills and other kinds of contaminated sites all over the Presidio, and had fragmented all of the park's kind of natural ecosystems. Pardon me. So at base closure, we had this, as I mentioned before, this 7% of the site that remained native habitat. And we had to develop a different way to think about it because these things were really beset by a whole host of really significant urban impacts, invasive species, human disturbance, feral dogs and cats, I mean, you name it, we had it. And so we had to step back and we had to ask ourselves, how can you take a place that is housing a community, a national park site that houses a community, that has to generate revenue to support itself, that sits in the middle of the San Francisco Bay Area. How can we create a place like this, take a place like this and restore it to ecological health if we only live in that place in that traditional nature culture dichotomy? So we quickly realized we couldn't, and that we had to develop a more expanded field of natures, an approach that was focused really on deep looking, on deeply understanding the place, on deeply understanding the way natural process expressed itself in the place. And then we really needed to create new models for how to think about restoring and managing biodiversity in a heavily modified urbanized landscape like the Presidio. Inspired by that and driven by that, and building on that, we developed a comprehensive master plan that set an ambition to reimagine the mostly historic Presidio in more ecological terms. And our master plan really focused on three big moves. Our first big move was focused on the relic natural areas that remained in the park. And what was important is that both we and the community had to shift their perspective, because at that time, these relic natural areas, based on prevailing policy in the Park Service, were treated like tiny bits of wilderness. And the idea was to just keep the public out of these spaces. And what we realized is that we had to really shift our perspective, that we had to begin to see people as the solution, not as the problem, when it comes to preserving natural areas in the urban environment. So we developed two really important things. First, we developed a really vibrant volunteer program to both provide the labor that we needed to support the restoration work and the invasive species removal and habitat work, but also so that we were creating this cohort of really well-informed stewards that could become advocates for the ecological values of the Presidio. So the second thing is we began this whole series of pilot programs that were aimed at taking land management strategies that are typically used in a wilderness context or in a more remote national park context. And we tried those in an urban context. So here we are doing a control burn. This is about 3 blocks from Dianne Feinstein's house. And we did it in these great metal boxes to make sure there was no possible way that they could get out of control. So this is just one of many examples of the kinds of experimentation that we engaged in. And we learned an incredible amount from that experimentation about how to steward the Presidio in a way that was really indigenous, really based on the unique qualities of the place. The second big move that we made had to do with addressing one of the key barriers to a healthy ecosystem, which is habitat fragmentation. And so we began a program of really aggressive habitat expansion, natural area restoration, which was really a challenge because the entire Presidio is a National Historic Landmark District. And the largest historic feature in the park is actually the 300-acre historic forest, which is spread all over. But there are also dozens and dozens of other landmarked historic landscapes in the post. So we had to be very careful how we did this. And we focused on a couple of strategies. Our first strategy was to take all of the junk in the park and remove it and restore those sites. And we had lots of junk. We had things like this water treatment plant that the Army had built to pump water out of Mountain Lake to irrigate the golf course. All told, we transformed about 100 acres of derelict pavement, old abandoned buildings, and derelict infrastructure. We also did a really important thing. We negotiated a transfer of responsibility for environmental cleanup from the Army. They transferred us $100 million. We took responsibility for doing all of the environmental cleanup, which meant that we didn't have to worry about their schedule. We had control over the timing, but it also meant that we could use the remediation program to not only eliminate contamination, but also to restore native ecosystems. So we used that remediation program and those remediation funds to restore places like Mountain Lake, the Tennessee Hollow watershed, and dune landscapes in the southwestern corner of the park. We also adopted a human-centered design approach to habitat restoration. And we did our best to understand the kinds of experiences the public was looking for. because one of the biggest barriers to our ability to restore these sites was the way the public had grown used to using them. So we had to understand how the public used these sites, create ways for the public to enjoy the sites, while at the same time restoring most of the sites to improve their ecological health. And we had to make a lot of mistakes. Again, it was an incredible experience of trial and error. And we really learned the hard way that when you're trying to make dramatic landscape change to restore natural ecosystems in the city, that it's essential that you work deeply with the community. And so we've really spent years working very, very diligently to build community stewardship, but also community understanding of the kinds of activities that you have to engage in to restore ecosystems in cities. Things like fish removals from Mountain Lake or extensive eucalyptus removal so that we could do habitat restoration. And we've again embraced this notion of prototyping and experimentation, doing things like creating the Mountain Lake Pledge, where we asked 10,000 children to take a pledge not to drop their goldfish and pet turtles in Mountain Lake, to things like creating an aquatic pet amnesty box, where kids that have grown tired of their fish and turtles and frogs can actually leave them, and we'll take them, and instead of dumping them into Mountain Lake, we'll take them to and give them new homes. So this constant approach of experimentation to try to understand what it takes to restore urban ecosystems. The third strategy that we focused on has been equally important, and that's this. We've been really focused on figuring out how we can increase the ecological value of the historic forest and the historic landscape zones that cover most of the Presidio. So we've really had to green the matrix. We've worked to build a whole set of new garden archetypes that are based on the natural ecosystems that live in the Presidio, but also embrace the historic plantings and the rich history of horticulture that is part of the fabric of the Presidio. We've developed and implemented an array of ecological horticulture practices, things like prohibitions on vegetation removal during bird nesting season, to ensure that our ongoing maintenance of the design landscape allows for the maximum biodiversity, insect diversity, bird diversity, to flourish in those zones. We've also created an urban wildlife research program so that we can understand how to mitigate the impact of humans and their pets, and their dogs especially, on the wildlife that are using the park. And this is just one of those examples, our coyote management program that allows us to track the whereabouts of all of the Presidio's coyotes. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we focused a lot of energy on building that next generation of stewards, so that we know that young people growing up today in cities will grow up to value nature and believe that parks and protected areas are not luxuries, but are essential. So through those approaches, all the various 3 strategies that I've outlined, we've really had great results. We've quadrupled the acreage of natural area at the Presidio. We've seen a huge increase in the populations of all of the Presidio's 21 rare, endangered, and threatened plant species. And we've seen an increase in biodiversity in all 3 of the zones. So not just in the natural areas, but also in the historic forest zone and in the design landscape zone. So this really left us with one final challenge in terms of achieving that urban park, national park vision. And that was really, how do we take a place like the Presidio and make it a national park for everyone? Since the first national parks were created in the United States in the 19th century, they have generally served visitors that are whiter, wealthier, and older than the general public. And this has been true from the very beginning. To address that reality, in the 1970s, the National Park Service created a number of urban national parks. The GGNRA was one of them, but there are others like Gateway and outside of New York City. And they were developed, as I mentioned earlier, to serve urban communities and to build a bridge between urban populations and more remote national parks. And they were developed on the premise that if you could bring national park experiences to urban audiences, that they would build a relationship to national parks, and that they would then be inspired to go further abroad. But the interesting thing is that it didn't really have that effect. We didn't see a huge increase, at least in the first couple of decades after those parks were created, a huge shift in the visitation to the national parks. And there's a lot of research about visitation patterns in national parks. And the Presidio has its own unique challenges that we've had to wrestle with in our effort to actually ensure that the Presidio serves everyone. And they're various. They really flow out of the unique characteristics of the place. The first is one that I experienced directly when I was a young boy and came to Robb Hill Campground to go camping, which is that it was a military base. And even though it was an open post, which is pretty unique, when you came up to the gate, no matter which gate you came into, you were greeted by a wall and a gate and a guy with a gun. And if you didn't look like you belonged in the Presidio or you didn't have a legitimate reason to be there, they just turned you around and sent you on your way. And so for generations, there was this feeling in San Francisco that the Presidio was a place for just the few. And it was reinforced by its military history and the realities of the open post. Exacerbating that problem is the fact that the Presidio is really wrapped by a wall of wealth, that all of the wealthiest neighborhoods in San Francisco and some of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the United States and maybe even the world wrap the Presidio, and they create this wall between the Presidio and other nearby, more diverse and lower income neighborhoods. The Presidio's need to be financially self-sufficient was another really interesting challenge that we had to wrap our heads around. Because we're the only national park in the United States that has to generate enough revenue to support itself each year, and there's a cap on the amount of square footage that we can build, we have to use every square foot to generate the most possible revenue. Well, as you can imagine, the impact of that is that we have inadvertently created one of the most expensive neighborhoods in San Francisco. We do have an affordable housing program. It has about 20% of the Presidio's housing in it. But the rest of our housing is among the most expensive places that you can live in San Francisco. The Presidio also has a very complicated history. And there's a lot of dark underbelly in that history. It's safe to say that the Presidio, starting from the arrival of the Spanish and the impact of colonialism on the indigenous people, to the history, the role of the Presidio in the evolution of the American West, there are many, many, many dark stories and dark chapters. And the thing that's complicated is that these events had very tragic consequences for many of the very communities that we're trying to serve. And so our strategy has been to not just throw open the gates and say, here we are, National Park for all. It's been to actually do something that is really conceptually very simple, but in practice really difficult, which is to build a ladder of engagement that builds an increasingly deep and meaningful relationship between the Presidio, the place, and those communities that are traditionally underrepresented in national park visitation and underserved by national parks. And we began this process, no surprise to all of you, because I know you do this as part of your practice, by listening and listening deeply. We listen to people that currently use the park, and we listen to people that are non-users. We listen to people in the park, and we went out into the community and tested ideas and got really important feedback. And we got a lot of really important feedback about the barriers that people were experiencing to coming to the Presidio, both perceived and real. For example, we heard that a lack of transit was a huge barrier for people to come, and that a lack of multilingual materials were a huge barrier to come, for visitors to come. So for example, we created a free shuttle. We implemented paid parking, and we used that revenue to fund a free shuttle, which gives rides to about 600,000 people a year. And that shuttle also goes out into underserved communities on the weekends to create a shuttle bridge between the Presidio and those neighborhoods. We heard a lot of feedback about the actual physical fabric of the Presidio, and that this sort of beautiful, stately, serene landscape that many people talk about was sterile, forbidding, uninviting, So we've worked with a number of different landscape firms and organizations to humanize the Presidio. For example, we worked with Rebar, now Gell Associates, to develop share chairs, which create places for people to sit and lounge and eat on the grass. They're sort of like big toys, but what's great is we can move them away if we ever need to, do a photo shoot and make the main parade ground look like its historic self. And the beautiful thing about this is that it's transformed the way people use the main post and the main parade, and the use of the main post has exploded since we've added these loose parts onto the parade ground. We heard that the community was incredibly hungry for classic national park experiences, these sort of gateway experiences like camping and hiking. So we built a new trail system. We built a new bikeway system. We restored San Francisco's only campground and turned it into a great national park camping experience. But then we created programs that were specifically designed to introduce urban kids to hiking, to create a first camping experience for those young people. And we prioritized our investment in those communities that have traditionally been underrepresented in national park visitation. So communities of color, young people that come from low-income families. By prioritizing that investment, we were able to ensure that we reached those communities and those young people first. We also have focused on leveraging the power of community to create the public realm in a whole variety of new ways. Now, in most national parks, traditionally in national parks, the strategy is for the National Park Service, who has an INTERC division, to create a series of programs. They develop the programs and then they deliver the programs. And instead, we focused on a very different approach, which is really reimagining the Presidio as a platform that the community can bring their programming to, so that we can work collaboratively with the community to co-create the public realm. And working together, we've created hundreds of different programs, ranging from free monthly ethnic dance performances to more permanent programs like temporary, but frankly, quasi-permanent, place-based artistic interventions with artists like Andy Goldsworthy that are really designed to reveal the Presidio's deeper history and the complexity of the place in some new and unique ways. These collaborations have been really important, and they've been really important not only because they've allowed us to activate the place, but because it's allowed us to begin the process of healing some of these darker chapters of the Presidio. Because to really transform the Presidio into a park for everyone, it's essential that we begin to shine a light on these darker chapters and begin that process of reconciliation so that the community develops a sense of ownership and develops a deeper relationship and allows the community to reposition the Presidio in their imaginations as a place that is theirs, that they own, and that is a part of their lives. So using this approach, we've begun the process of transforming the Presidio into a park for all. We went from a park where in our first survey in 2009, 80% of our visitors were upper income white visitors, to a park that now mirrors the ethnic, income, and age diversity of the Bay Area. So solid progress, but there is so much more to do. This work of transforming a place like the Presidio into a park for all is really work that's never done. I'm grateful to all of you for listening to me today. And I want to end with a couple of questions, because you're all Presidio users. So the questions are these, I should say. Have we struck the right balance? Have we hit the mark? And what would you do differently if you were in charge of the Presidio? So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Maybe just drop them in the chat if anyone wants to volunteer some thoughts about that, and then I'm happy to answer questions. So Carrie, with that, I think I'll unshare my screen and let's get talking.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for that presentation. Lots of to think about, and those thought-provoking questions at the end. I welcome any comments from the audience.
Hey, Claire, I see you on my screen, Claire Cooper Marcus. See you. So I'm going to embarrass Claire. Claire was a huge piece of the inspiration for me to get involved in and for us to approach the development of the National AIDS Memorial Grove in the way that we did. It was actually the stint that I did when I was at Cal in Claire's class that taught me a lot of, and taught us all a number of the skills that we needed to use to build that project. So great to see you.
Oh, we do have a question in. Can you talk about the Doyle Drive land bridge?
Sure. Yeah, I didn't talk about that because it's not done yet. So we're in the process, Doyle Drive, as you know, 1989 was a big year in the life of the Presidio. So 1989, we had the Loma Prieta earthquake, and Doyle Drive was, as a result of that, determined that it needed to be replaced, that it wasn't really structurally sound for the long haul. Community came together. Caltrans developed some proposals for how to redevelop the Doyle Drive. Michael Painter and Spur developed a different vision, a vision for a parkway that they brought to the Trust and the Park Service, and really inspired us. And inspired us in part because there were a couple of really great things that it would allow us to do: restore the Tennessee Hollow watershed, but also build these two sets of cut and cover tunnels that we could build parklands over. So we've been working with James Corner on the main post tunnels, and that project is going to completely flip the Presidio on its head. It's going to take an area that used to be an edge, because the freeway really cut the park in two, and transform it into the very center of the park, and allow us to create something we've always needed, which is a starting point. Because one of the pieces of feedback we've heard from the community is they don't know where to begin their experience of the Presidio. So it's going to be 14 acres of new park. The whole process from the very beginning, from the Imagine phase, where we brought on 5 wonderful firms to develop 5 concepts. And then we tested those concepts with about 10,000 members of the public to get their feedback. From the very beginning, that process has been shaped by and built to support the community and the use of the park by the community. So we're in the thick of construction right now. The project is going to open in April of 2022. And I look forward to seeing you all there.
That's exciting to hear. And just to follow up on that, and I know you also have a hard stop at 1 o'clock. So I'm keeping an eye on the time, but just to follow up on that, the youth campus that's planned for that new 14 acres, can you expand on what are the plans for that campus? What is it meant for? Who is it meant to bring in? Who will occupy it?
Yeah, great question. So the project is on 2 levels. There's the portion of the project that's up at the level of the main post and is over the tunnels. And that's really a community commons and a kind of gateway space for visitors. But then the lower area, the lower portion of the site that's down at the level of Chrissy Field is this new youth campus. And the way I think about the youth campus, it's a kind of funnel for youth. And it's going to deliver 3 primary components. The first is a new feature called the Outpost. And the Outpost is a nature play environment. It's designed to allow hundreds of thousands of young people each year to connect with nature and to challenge themselves to take beneficial risks. So the whole thing will feel like a field of dunes and coastal bluffs and woodland. And layered into that are a series of different experiences that are designed to allow kids to challenge themselves at their own pace. And it will be completely built of natural materials and restored using species native to the Presidio, to the Crissy Field area. And that it's designed because one of the barriers that we've encountered, one of the big challenges we have is we have so much demand for nature-based experiences for kids that the natural ecosystems that we've restored can't sustain them. There simply isn't enough actual native ecosystem to support that level of use. So that's the widest part of the funnel. A couple 100,000 young people a year coming and beginning to connect to nature. And then the second element, and that's designed by JCFO. The second element is a field station, which is a drop-in environmental education center. And that building is designed by EHDD, and exhibits have been developed by the Trust in collaboration with the Exploratorium. And that's a place for fine motor skills and connecting with nature in a deeper way. And then the third element of the youth campus is a new and expanded Crissy Field Center, which is a youth development and environmental education center for youth. And the focus of the field station and the Crissy Field Center will be on kids that have traditionally not had access to national parks and to the Presidio. So we'll build on our network of community partners to make sure that we're reaching primarily Title I schools. We always prioritize those, so that we're making sure we're reaching the lowest income children in our community and creating opportunities for them to develop physically, to develop a relationship with nature, but also to develop potentially careers in conservation, in land management, and in other kinds of environmental fields. So it's a really exciting campus. It'll allow us to take all of the learnings that we've had over the last couple decades really to scale, so we can serve every child in San Francisco in one way.
So we do have a couple of comments. Elaine says, I think that a wonderful balance has been struck. We raised our daughters in San Francisco and spent so much time at the beach in Crissy Field, the dog beach, hiking all over the Presidio and going to Baker Beach. Her elementary school had an overnight field trip at Fort Scott, and we also enjoy going to the restaurants. And then Bob asks, do you feel the Trust phytophthora control program is succeeding? What do you think can be done to enlist more enthusiasm and participation by the various commercial nurseries that supply various Presidio projects?
Wow, Phytophthora, I love that question. We have a very aggressive Phytophthora control program, and you know what? Probably the best thing I can suggest is that you send me an email and let's have a conversation about it, because it's a complicated subject. But the bottom line is we test every plant before it arrives in the park, and we have a Phytophthora-free on-site nursery, and it's allowed us to really minimize the impact of Phytophthora on the Presidio, particularly the impact on our natural ecosystems, which is critical because a lot of the native species we use are really, really sensitive to Phytophthora. But yeah, send me an email and I'll connect you up with our IPM specialist who's an expert in Phytophthora.
And then Amy asked, this might be a very niche question, but can you talk about how you think about balancing public park functionality and access with cemetery spaces like the National Cemetery and the Merchant Marine Cemetery?
Yeah, it's complicated because people have very high expectations about the sanctity and a lot of those spaces and a lot of preconceptions about the kinds of activities that are appropriate in them. The VA actually manages the National Cemetery in the Presidio, and they patrol it and they set the criteria for how it's used. We've created trails that lead up to it, and we created a new overlook up at the top of it, which if you haven't been up to the National Cemetery overlook, it's really one of the hidden gems in the Presidio, designed by a member of my team. And it's the way that we tell the story of the place and we provide access to the place. The Merchant Marine Cemetery, for those of you who don't know it, is buried under a dune field, which is built on top of a layer of contamination that we couldn't remove because the Merchant Marine Cemetery was below it and working their way up the contaminated sediment. Yet another of the crazy things about the Presidio. So we built an overlook and again tried to tell the story and to honor the soldiers that are buried there, but to keep people out of that space. Both a reflection of the sensitivity of the habitat, but also a sign of respect for the primarily men that are buried in that area.
And then Gretchen asks, what was your stakeholder engagement process for the tunnel tops? Did the community's voices make a difference?
Yeah, they made a huge difference. We had a multi-pronged approach, starting with the Imagine phase, when we built a design lab on the site where we displayed all 5 of the solutions, the proposed concepts for the site. We then took the 5 concepts out into the community and went to the neighborhoods that had the lowest visitation of the Presidio, reflected based on the visitation study that we've done. And we worked with our community partners to convene groups of citizens in those neighborhoods to get their feedback about the ideas that resonated the most. And we then pulled those ideas together. We used that to select the scheme, to select the team, but we also used it to harvest other ideas that weren't in any of the schemes. And then we worked with James Corner, who's been incredibly collaborative throughout this process, to pull those ideas into the final scheme that they developed for the site. And then since that time, we've been working with community partners to develop the programmatic vision for the tunnel tops and the Presidio. We brought on a group of 15 community activators, this Activators Council, 15 individuals that represent the diversity of the San Francisco community that we've brought on to help us develop this programmatic vision and also build the network of partnerships so that we can be sure that the programs that we're developing really reflect the aspirations and needs of the community. So that process doesn't end. It just changes. Once you get to a certain point in construction, it goes from being focused on hard assets to being focused on these soft assets.
And we have a few more comments and questions. Drew writes, this was a great presentation. I wonder if you've ever given or would give a similar talk to the ASLA conference. Also, I'm in awe of the vision and the execution of the plan over time. Were there any precedents for the partnership of the trust with the NPS and the layers of program development over time? Or is this unique? And is it being recreated by other national historic sites?
Yeah, so when we were trying to come up with a management solution for the Presidio, the Conservancy brought together a group of 35 experts from across the country and created something called the Presidio Council. And the council developed a vision for a new kind of federal agency. And the organization we learned the most from was the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation, which was develop Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. And the executive director of PADC was on this council and helped develop this vision for a new kind of federal agency. And so the trust was, built on the shoulders of others that had built similar things, but then has given birth to a variety of other organizations, the Governor's Island Trust, the Sydney Harbor Trust. Parks from all over the world are coming and want to understand, Brooklyn Bridge Park, when they were working on the concept for that, they came to the Presidio and tried to understand our business model. So a lot of parks are coming, trying to understand how we strike the balance between our need to generate revenue and to serve the public, which it's a tough balance to strike.
Another comment, what a complicated and impactful series of interrelated projects. We are impressed and inspired by your team's commitment and tenacity. Thank you. And then I believe there's one more question in the audience from Maria. Maria, if you don't mind unmuting yourself and asking your question.
Yeah, I actually, mine is a little bit, well, thank you so much. And it was a little bit maybe more comprehensive and understanding, specifically about this distinction between the artist versus a painter and, landscape architects and the agency. I think that this last question that you answered gives a lot towards that and really understanding, public-private partnerships and how that can work in order to really push forward parks such as, what we saw today. So thank you so much. And I will wrap it there so you have time. I understand that you have to cut off. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. And anyone, please come visit us. If you have questions, Carrie knows how to find me. Drop me a line, drop me an email, and come visit us. I'd be delighted to host you. Definitely come in the spring when the tunnel tops open. So.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for joining us and for your talk. And with that, I think we will wrap up for today.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, ASL.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks so much.